Good afternoon. Welcome to our symposium on African photography, the ethics of looking and collecting in the age of restitution. I really want to thank the audience. For those of you who continued from the morning session, the questions have been fantastic, very serious and substantive. And so we want to make sure to preserve time, as much time as possible for questions. You can find biographies in the program, which is linked in the chat. I'll only say a few words about each of the speakers, just to give you a little background to what they'll be doing today. And then they will speak sequentially before we open it up to discussion. So our first speaker is Professor John Peffer, who teaches in the art history department in Ramapo College in New Jersey. His book, The Struggle for Art, asks the questions about what does it mean to have been an artist during the apartheid era in South Africa, at a time of heated nationalist debates, anti-apartheid struggles, and accusations of CIA collusions. His current research promises to be equally original. A 2013 exhibition at the International Center for Photography in New York focused entirely on the rich history of documentary photography in apartheid South Africa. It left viewers overwhelmed by graphic scenes of violence and resistance. However, John urges us to remember that those images were produced entirely for export with serious political motivation, and that they've only become available to in South Africa relatively recently. So instead, today, John will be addressing the rich cornucopia of images produced by Black South Africans for themselves, which provide important evidence for how people were able to build lives in the midst of trauma. So I think we'll hear an interesting resonance between his presentation and that of Lebohang Kyangye in the morning. So the puzzle John selects to pursue in this project is why people manipulated their photographs through play acting, montage, and repainting during the apartheid period. And it's extremely important to note that this research has actually led him to a meditation about privacy rights. Who exactly, legally, historically, morally, should profit from the dissemination of personal images? He will have a book out relatively soon called Sample Album, How Do We Look?, in which he shares and theorizes people's desire for opacity around their personal photographs. And he experiments with an intersubjective format for narrating those images. Our second speaker, Sandrine Colard, is on the faculty of Rutgers, Newark. And since she joined them in 2018, she's been developing an innovative curatorial research and series of writing projects. Strikingly, she was invited to direct the 6th edition of the Lubumbashi Biennale in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Future Genealogies, Tales from the Equatorial Line. In 2021, she opened an important exhibition at the Middelheim Museum in Antwerp called Congoville, which invited contemporary artists to engage as Black flaneurs, these physical and psychic traces of the colonial era in the Belgian cityscape. And beginning next year, we're pleased to congratulate her that she'll be acting also as curator at large at Canal Pompidou in Brussels. For today's project, it's good for you to know that she's writing a book on the history of photography in colonial Congo. Through careful examination of the colonial archives, she maintains that there was a concerted effort beginning in the 1910s to lure reluctant workers to the Congo through a process of familiarization. Reassuring images of what they call the Belgian Congolese family advertised a peaceful and harmonious social landscape with plenty of modern amenities. She's also fleshed out this project by identifying Congolese working for the colonial state, and she's recovered a fascinating series of photo albums in Lubumbashi. So this original research considers Congolese as consumers of images, many of whom sought to find a place for themselves within colonial society. And our third speaker is my close partner in organizing the symposium, Giulia Paoletti, on the faculty, Department of Art at University of Virginia. You should know that she has a book coming out with Princeton University Press called Photography and Visuality in Senegal, scheduled for spring 2024. So as you all noted in the title, Giulia refuses to collapse differences to construct a generic Senegalese photography, and her work respects the cosmopolitan heterogeneity of the young nation state. You can get a taste of what's to come in an article that recently came out in Art History called On Islam and Portraiture, in which she explores the intermedial relationship of lithography, glass painting, and photography in Senegal. And basically, importantly, she argues that it was Muslims who introduced mimetic images to Senegal in the form of chromolithographs and glass paintings from Morocco, Syria, and elsewhere. Through careful archival research, she also documents that local Muslims co-opted colonial surveillance photographs, even cutting them out of books and libraries, to create portraits of renowned imams and teachers, which have since become models for veneration. Strikingly, photography has assumed unrivaled importance in several of the most established Sufi fraternities in West Africa. So as well as expanding the canon through her work on Islam, she is also forging an intersectional approach sensitive to class as her work moves seamlessly from elite and middle-class urbanites to rural clients. And she's been working with a really gifted photographer based in the countryside, Umar Ka, with extremely fresh photos to bring to our attention. So the end result of her study presents a socially complex mosaic of Senegalese society, such as we seldom see here in the West. So I welcome you all today, and we'll begin with Professor Peffer. Everyone, please note your questions are welcome if you could write them in the Q&A box. So thank you.
I'm just going to go on screen for a moment to thank Zoe Struther personally for inviting me today. Since the Restitution conference at the Italian Academy in 2019, I've been in Zoe's ear about how I think, from what I'm seeing from my own research, that photography should be included in the restitution issues debate. If not for photographs from the past, perhaps thinking forward to prevent the need for restitution in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. So thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Giulia. This is sort of a dream come true that we're having a conference on this subject. I also wanted to say to David Friedberg, Il Maestro, as a student, you were a role model, intellectual role model for me, and in my writing and my teaching, you continue to be an intellectual model and inspiration, including, I think, the hosting of this conference today. So I thank you personally, David Friedberg, for all that you've done. Since 2010, I have been researching the reception of paper photography during its heyday in South Africa's Black communities, roughly the years 1950 to 1990, which is also an era that's synonymous with the rise and fall of apartheid. For me, it has been useful to reframe African portrait photography as family photography, so that its aspect as a medium for creating social identities and social networks is kept in mind. It follows then that subjects seen in African portrait photography should have rights, and that they should be considered authors, as creators, and as even owners of their own images. In 2020, I published an essay in the journal Chronos with the rigorous guidance and eagle eye of Patricia Hayes, where I enumerated the many personal, cultural, and historical reasons that people have shared with me over the past 10 years for wanting to keep their photographs private. Their reservations made me curious whether photographic subjects had any legal rights, and that will be my focus today. But first, I want to explain something. In South Africa, young men and women in courtship traded pictures. Close friends had their snaps taken together and each would get a copy. Women related through marriage gifted snaps to each other. Relatives in the city sent photos to the family in the country and vice versa. Only those who could be trusted, those who were family or close friends, would be given a copy. Visitors might be shown certain pictures on special occasions, but they would not be allowed to take them or make copies for their own use. When a parent passes away, often their images are distributed among siblings and children along careful lines of succession. These images and their distribution networks helped define personal networks and affirmed relationships and boundaries that defined families and selves. Elizabeth Edwards writes that, quote, photographs are not merely a result of social relations, but active within them, maintaining, reproducing, and articulating shifting relations, and they distribute personhood beyond the body boundary. Family photographs are like parts of oneself that are allowed with caution to be shared with others. Consensual sharing within familiar networks constitutes the persona. It creates individual and corporate identities, and it is a means for exploring subjectivity. Family photographs enact the private domain, that space for personal and cohort experimentation, including play and crisis, that sometimes belongs out of full public view. Privacy is not a negative refusal of public engagement. It is a positive and dynamic form of choosing of where and when and how to engage the self or one's indicia within the public sphere. In camera, in that quasi-public changing room of modernity, subjects styled themselves in portrait snaps for self-use and for distribution to familiars. But privacy is disturbed when these pictures are distributed outside their intended networks, allowing strangers to peek into the dressing room without consent. According to the Copyright Act of South Africa of 1978, a person who commissions a portrait photograph is the one who owns it. It's not ambiguous. Ownership includes the right to distribute, make copies, or sell the image. Even if the subject fails to pay, they still retain ownership. The photographer has moral rights to credit by name and to forbid alteration of the integrity of their work. But the one who commissioned the photograph is the legal owner, and almost always this is the subject depicted. In the townships, what I found was that few families had cameras at home until the rise of cell phones and cameras in the 2000s. And Lebuang was also talking about that in her presentation. Even pictures that to an overseas viewer might look like Instamatic camera informal pictures were usually made by local professionals who roamed the neighborhoods and worked for hire. So if a neighborhood photographer in Soweto is invited to photograph a gathering or even just take a picture of you in a nice suit standing in front of your home or your car, then you still retain the copyright to your image. The current sections on photography in the Copyright Act were taken over from the earlier Copyright Act 63 of 1965. Both versions were written during the apartheid era under the Republic of South Africa. They in turn had carried forward the spirit of the Patents, Designs, Trademarks, and Copyright Act 9 of 1916, which was created during the Union of South Africa. The United Kingdom Imperial Copyright of 1911 was included as a schedule in the South African Act of 1916 in its entirety. The statutory split that I was speaking about earlier between the author with moral rights and the owner with copyrights is a relic of an even earlier era, though. It dates from the 1860s, which was a period when the collodion to albumin process was helping create what we today would call a star system, since it facilitated the copying and the wide distribution, and thus a collectible aspect for photographic portraits. Photography first appears in British copyright with the Fine Art Copyright of 1862, whose first section already states that the commissioner owns the copyright, not the photographer. This provision was included to protect the privacy of sitters because it was understood in the mid-19th century that the person who was, quote, the owner of the face in a photograph should have rights to their own face. As stated in an 1874 essay titled The Right to One's Own Face, the rule amongst portraitists is not to part with a single copy of a private portrait without the authority of the sitter. I think that this backward glance is valuable because it gives us a model for our own early 21st century, where today the face is again increasingly commoditized, now on digital platforms by ordinary people and not just by celebrities. It also indicates that the market for images for the paper photography era has not been honoring historic subjects' rights in Africa, or for that matter, abroad. Since we can trace the current formula for determining photographic copyright in South Africa to the Fine Art Copyright Act of 1862, this means that photographers, to the extent that they were informed at all or were interested in copyright issues, should reasonably have been expected to know that these basic legal rules of their craft, which incidentally were also published annually in the photographic press, existed. It was also anecdotally confirmed to me by former studio operators that enthusiasts and professionals and members of camera clubs in the townships all had ready access to this knowledge. Perhaps more importantly, I was told by these former studio operators that their business was based on trust with their clients and that reselling their patrons' images would have violated that trust. In South Africa, copyright extends to 50 years from the end of the year a photograph has first been made public, whether it was with consent or not. If a photograph was created and the owner is known, but it was never made public by consent of its owner, then its copyright extends to 50 years after it was first made. But this does not describe the current practices of the art market, because most, if not all, works of African vernacular photography seen abroad have been reprinted, sold, exhibited, and placed on websites without the subject's consent and with the subjects remaining anonymous. In almost every case, the subject has not been asked for consent. That means the term of copyright lasts until 50 years after the death of the subject. So now we have to think about, when would this person have died? Imagine a studio photograph made in Pretoria, South Africa in 1950 of someone who was by choice or because of lack of information anonymous. Let us say the person was 20 years old at the time. If we grant them a respectable lifespan of 70 years, this picture would only become available for others to reproduce, distribute, and sell after the year 2050. This provision is meant to protect the privacy of the pictured persons during their lifetime, and also to ensure that their descendants may control distribution or monetizing of their ancestors' faces for at least a generation after they have passed. Portrait photographs are expressive property protected by copyright. They are also image objects embedded in cultural conventions about what constitutes one's persona and one's identity. That is, to senses of wholeness and self-determination, and to privacy and dignity. These more personal aspects of identity are considered in South African law as rights to personality and are ultimately derived from the Roman Dutch actio in iuriarium. The personality rights generally, and these personality rights generally end with the death of the person, but not always. In the United States, related rights to publicity may be passed to one's family. In France and many Francophone countries, the droit à l'image, the right to one's own image, lasts for the lifetime of a person, though there, as in South Africa, an extension of duration could be argued to protect the dignity of the immediate family. According to Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ability to have one's privacy respected is considered a fundamental and natural right, defining in a sense what it is to be an individual human subject. South African courts also consider the right to privacy to be an independent personality right within the larger concept of dignitas, which is furthermore granted at the highest level by the 1997 Constitution in Section 14 of the Bill of Rights. In the Handbook of South African Copyright Law, privacy is defined as all information or personal facts that about an individual that are, quote, excluded from disclosure to others. The criterion for determining what are personal facts is the choice of the individual, and thus the ambit of their privacy is what they choose to keep private. Related to the right of privacy, though some authors consider it a separate right, is the right to identity, which is a person's right to control over their own distinctive indicia. The indexes are indicators of signs of the self, such as a signature, a name, a common appearance, a photograph, or other likeness. And therefore, internationally widely recognized torts or delicts of privacy: intrusion into solitude or private affairs, public disclosure of private facts, false attribution of character to a person, and appropriation of name or likeness. The case most often cited by South African legal scholars as a precedent for protection of privacy via public disclosure of private facts involves actually the misuse of portrait photography. In 1957, a man named Alison Mhlongo sued the powerful Bailey family, who were the owners of the Black culture magazine Drum, because they had published 2 private photographs of him without permission in an article on singer Dolly Ratebe's famous lovers titled Dolly and Her Men. Mhlongo won his case and was awarded damages for aggression upon his dignitas and invasion of privacy. The other obvious personality tort most relevant to photography is appropriation, the making of something into one's private property for one's own use that in fact belongs to another person, such as their name, their image, their likeness. As South African legal scholar David McCoy Mason defines it, appropriation means that a person's image or likeness is used without their consent. And furthermore, appropriation is clearly a violation of a person's right to decide for herself who should have access to her image and likeness. And this goes to the root of individual autonomy and privacy. Of course, fair use exceptions should apply to scholarly work, and other variables are applied to celebrities, politicians, and other public figures whose images are newsworthy, since the line between private and public may be drawn differently for notorious personae. But my concern is to focus on the overlooked but more common subjects, on the rights of the non-famous people, who are the majority of people in their everyday depictions of themselves through popular forms of photography, because it is their private pictures that have enlivened the market in African photography in recent years. Please allow me in closing to widen the scope. In 1999, Elizabeth Bigham's essay, which is well known to African art historians, Issues of Authorship in the Portrait Photographs of Seydou Keïta, was published in African Arts. It appeared in the second of 2 special issues that discussed various concepts of authorship that have been applied to African art in their traditional context and in their later distribution abroad. The special issues were built around a set of symposium papers in response to the exhibition Master Hand, Individuality, and Creativity Among Yoruba Sculptures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1997, organized, I believe, by Elisa Lagama. My colleagues may remember that the late 1990s was a time when scholarly attention was shifting from traditional arts on an ethnic style model to modern inflections of tradition, to contemporary gallery art, and to photography, and that Liz Bigham's essay in African Arts was a kind of signpost at this crossroads. So it is interesting to return to that essay now and see what she said about authorship in portrait photography in Mali. In her essay, Bigham carefully outlined how Seydou Keïta's studio images from the 1950s were being remediated by the international art culture of the 1990s, which was seeing in Keïta a kind of new art world star. But in their original context, the studio and client would have been understood as co-creators. Clients, she writes, quote, did not want his studio stamp on just any image, but on an image they identified with their own authorial presences. The Keïta stamp, like their clothing and other accessories, was part of their engagement with surfaces through which they created an ideal image of themselves. Keïta, the studio photographer, was in this way an accessory to his client's identity making. What Bigham calls the first authorship of the subject in the studio was effaced by the late life fame of the photographer in the international art world. And we all know this already. So let me move to another place with this. The context of Bigham's essay was a special issue on the question of authorship. And perhaps for that reason, she did not consider the question of subjects' rights or ownership rights for Keïta's or for any other Malian photographer's sitters. If we can do that now, then the wider stakes of what I've been speaking about that reach beyond South Africa may become apparent. The Malian Constitution of 1992 contains provisions for both dignity and privacy as fundamental rights. The Malian Penal Code 2001-11, Section 2, Article 126, also protects against invasion of privacy, similar to what is called the droit à l'image in French law. In Mali, the copyright laws were changed in 2008. Before 2008, just as in South Africa, the subject of a portrait had to give consent for their image to be reprinted or sold. That protection for individuals was removed in 2008. This may have been done to bring local law into alignment with what is called the International Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works. It may also have been done, and this is Candace Keller's suggestion to me when I spoke with her about this, it may have been done to give an economic boost to Malian photographers who had become prominent in the art world since the 1990s. Either way, it is standard practice internationally that with these kinds of statutory rights changes, they are usually not applied retroactively. They are only applied going forward. So for the era that is most collectible, that is the print photography era in West Africa from the 50s to the 70s, the earlier rule that protected portraiture clients ought to still apply. We see a similar thing in the United Kingdom in 1988 and the United States in 1978, where likewise what was called the 4 higher provisions within copyright law were altered to remove these subject rights. But there too, the earlier rules always applied to the earlier eras of works. Lastly, since this is the center of the art market, where new values are given to old objects as they are copied, exhibited, and sold, it is important to note that in the United States, copyright in foreign works, that is the South African or the Malian works that enter the market here, for those foreign works, the rules of the country from which the works originate, including the original definitions of authorship, are supposed to be applied. South African studio photographs copied or sold abroad in the United States should follow the ownership rules of South African law. The obvious problem is that bringing suit in court is too expensive for most people, and photographic subjects, who are in fact the owners of the faces, are very likely not aware that their faces are even being monetized in this way, and they're therefore not able to do much about it. And I'm not confident that this situation is going to change anytime soon, barring some kind of, in the papers, well-publicized challenge by an activist lawyer. But if that happens, I'm happy to offer this text as a roadmap. Thank you.
A lot to think about there. Thank you, John. And now we'll go to Sandrine Colard.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can see me. And I will add my voice to the chorus of thanks to Professor Strother and to Professor Paoletti for organizing this wonderful conference. It is a pleasure to speak after John Peffer and this great presentation, and I think there will be some interesting echoing points between our two presentations. So my presentation today is called Another Substance of the Image, the author or biographical textures of African photographs. And I'm going to time myself just to make sure I'm not going overboard. When African photography became the darling of the international art world in the 1990s, the art historian Kobina Mercer astutely remarked that what characterized these multiplying exhibitions was their belatedness. Revealing the likes of Seydou Keïta and Mama Kassé to ravished Western audiences, these marvelous studio portraits, Mercer said, were shaken from their decades-long latency to return and meet viewers who finally, I quote, recognize their historical and aesthetic values. These archival images, he continued, were intelligible and meaningful in this second life, end of quote. This afterlife was and continues to be intrinsically diasporic, with prints exhibited, bought, researched, admired, and auctioned in New York, Paris, and Brussels, very much following the colonial trajectories that dispersed classical African art objects a century prior, what is today at the center of the restitution debate. Yet, when 20th century African studio portraiture became internationally recognized, its first continental existence was surely far from over. Both authors and many of their sitters were and are sometimes still alive, and for them, the time-lapse experience by Western-based spectators was not an afterlife, but just time passing on their lives. If we focus on the now well-rehearsed case of Seydou Keïta's rise to fame, it is not difficult to imagine that the ease with which he was found in Bamako after being anonymously exhibited in New York in 1991 could probably have been extended to the crowds populating his images. The youngest of Keïta's models, as we can see here, would have been middle-aged in the 1990s. With the higher estimates of 30,000 negatives in Keïta's archive, preserved with the initial purpose of satisfying customers' requests for reprints, it is clear that Bamako's living rooms and family albums must have concealed many of Keïta's prints, together with their subjects' memories. Nevertheless, at the time when the discourse about Keïta and other African studio portraitists was actively molding their images into author-centric, acceptable art commodities, risking the heteroglossia of the thousands of sitters' voices would probably have made the enterprise too open-ended. Similarly, the attention to the personal uses of these initially private pictures would have brought them too close to the vernacular at a time when it had not yet entered photographic institutions. Until today, most portraits bearing Keïta's signature remain untitled, as it is the case here, or have received belated made-up titles. However, as late as 2014, and here during one of my research trips in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one could find family and friends portraits in their homes made by renowned practitioners such as Jean de Parra in this case. By then, a long-established name in the African photographic canon, de Parra's stamp could be found at the back of these vintage prints, and I hope you can see it on the bottom right-hand side. The prints, the stamps used to evolve, and here, since it's a picture made in 1962, the studio photo is now called Independence. So the Parra stamp could be found at the back of these vintage prints, or his name just dotted at the back of them. But above all, the photographs were identified by their sitters. These pictures in this slide were seen in Kinshasa during a visit in the Freitas family, heirs to the pioneer photographer Antoine Freitas. On the right, the portrait of two young girls is attributed to de Parra and shows family friends, one of whom was recognized as the young Elizabeth. And I say attributed because the backdrop and the uncertain date, there's a hesitation between 1937 and 1957, make me think that this photograph could actually be a portrait made by Antoine Freitas himself. On the left, I was told that these three dashing ladies were three Freitas aunts posing for de Parra in the well-known Afro Club, better known from its exterior facade, thanks to the popularity of the image in the Revue Noire collection that you can see here on the right-hand side. This short introduction first intends to oppose the assumption that the names and stories of the people in modern African studio portraits are irremediably lost. Second, it shows that what has turned into fine art material in museums and galleries of the world has not stopped living as somebody else's personal pictures, in family albums, or more generally, as vernacular expressions, and that we should not let that artificially created frontier repress and absolutely fundamental dimensions of those pictures. To adopt the sitter's point of view offers much more than the rightful return of silenced voices. In my manuscript about the history of photography in the Congo, the inclusion of families' vernacular practices and products, and more specifically of the family album, has opened formidable and so far largely untapped possibilities for engaging the conception and practices of African photographies, such as the assemblage of images, the haptic experience, the narrations, and of course the biographies. In spite of being a wealth of resources, rare has been the examination of African family albums. These narrations and biographies about models and family photographs incredibly enrich the image of meanings that allow getting access to an African subjectivity and develop theories of African photography in much less sweeping terms. For a long time, a large part of African self-portraitures in colonial days have revolved around the advent of a loosely defined modernity, cosmopolitanism, of a break or preservation of Africanness, social idealization, and bourgeois aspirations. But the recitation of family and individual lives from albums, the visual progress of subjects in becoming, gives an intimate and dense texture to photographs, revealing a fuller rendering of African subjective experience, intermingling the experience of the intimate and personal with that of collective imagining. The fieldwork image here shows myself interviewing Kanuto Chenge, a nationally renowned Congolese sculptor. It was in his house in Lubumbashi that I sat down with him for the first time in 2014, one day before his 79th birthday. He opened boxes and photo albums for me and generously shared the innumerable stories that his extraordinary memory had kept. I will focus on just one studio portrait that his mother commissioned when Kanuto was just a small child. And this is the album from the family. But this is the photograph that I am talking about. And here on the extreme left of the image, first rank, you can see Kanuto as a young child. The unusual care that he had put into preserving his family pictures was very likely spurred by this photograph being his only souvenir of his mother. Her premature death had left him an orphan at only 5-year-old. In Chenge's collection, this last picture of his mother, taken a few months before her passing, and the only one together with him, was this group portrait with his brothers, taken in 1939 in their hometown of Albertville, present-day Calamie, after a trip to a photographer named Ambroise Santos. From Chenge's account, and in a very condensed version for the sake of this presentation, I learned that Santos, the photographer, was mixed race, just like the siblings were. Born from a Flemish father and a Black mother, children born from these interracial unions, like the Chenges, were seen at the time as deplorable accidents and heavily stigmatized, frequently taken away from their mothers to be placed in so-called colonies scolaires. I also learned from Kanuto Chenge that the mother, Madeleine, was then pregnant with the twins whose delivery would cause her death a few months later. I also learned from him that the textile perfectly hung at the back was in fact always floating because of the Lake Tanganyika's wind, but that exceptionally, the photographer had gone the extra mile to make sure that this time it would be evenly stretched and as stable as possible, with Madeleine as the uncontestable center of gravity of the image, anchored right in the middle with her children deployed around her like a little guard. In short, Madeleine had chosen a photographer who was himself a métis and who could only have been sensitive to what was at stake for the Chengues, to this performance as a unified family and legitimate family. Finally, given the mortality rate of the times, Madeleine may very well have intended to create this portrait as a talisman against the separation that could and finally came. Now, hung by itself on a wall, stripped from this storytelling, how differently would have that photograph signified? How impoverished would have been the appreciation of this incredibly poignant, highly staked photographic moment. But also, for this one willingly and generously shared personal history, how many will never be known or retained for the totally legitimate right to privacy and opacity. There are no easy answers to these questions. However, I very much agree with artist Zina Sarawiwa when she foregrounds storytelling about African art objects as a response to the calls for restitution and decolonization, advocated for that even on the same level as geographical restitution. Differently from sculptures or masks, the reproducible nature of photograph makes that in theory, and I insist on in theory, being hung on the wall of the Metropolitan Museum does not prevent another print of the same picture from existing across the ocean. Yet, the fine art, still largely Western-based discourse about photographs has been limiting. A curatorial attempt at redressing that imbalance was organized during the Lubumbashi Biennale that I curated in 2019. A historical axis revisited the local uses of photography in the Congo, both by the colonial propaganda and African practitioners of the time. Entitled The Recaptioning Project, a large exhibition at the City Museum presented a series of photographic diptychs which looked like this. On the left was an image selected from the some 20,000 images digitized in Belgium of Infor Congo, the Belgian propaganda photographic service. This visual construction of the country by the imperial power still largely circulates today, often uncritically, to illustrate the history of the Congo, both within the DRC and abroad. In order to challenge their alleged historical neutrality, the image was presented on the administrative file that systematically accompanied it with its typewritten original caption. Underneath, handwritten by Lubumbashi artist Papa Musasa, is the new Congolese caption resulting from the interviews and research conducted by myself and the curatorial assistant of the Lubumbashi Biennale, Maggie Watunya. An art historian, Watunya had spent the year before the opening presenting these images locally to the generations which had lived the colonial era and their descendants, asking them about their memories in relation to the image or their interpretations of it. In the diptychs, the propaganda image was then juxtaposed with photographs and albums from Congolese families having preserved images of their forebears, and this integration of private archives in the reinterpretation of Congo's colonial past allowed to subvert and reshape the dominant historical narratives. By opposition to the contemporary situation that still sees the West too often hold the exclusivity of the commentary about the colonial past, the exhibition was intended as a repatriation of the discussion about colonial visual regimes, to the Congolese communities of people and artists. It was also important for me to make the Congolese the first audience of this research, at the opposite of a practice of extraction of information to produce knowledge and scholarship shared and consumed elsewhere. The animation and lively discussions that were born in front of these images showed the strong sense of ownership of the past that young and elderly people alike were experiencing. To conclude, the surface or substance of the image has been a prime theoretical interest in African photography, famously developed by Olu Ogwibe, then Christopher Pini. Based on Indian and Malian studio portraiture, Pini very provocatively argued that a vernacular modernism was at work, one which, by juxtaposing backdrops and layers of textile, thickened the print or charged the print, and was akin to a refusal of colonial chronotypes and Cartesian perspectives. It is very interesting that the different lives of vernacular and fine art prints manifest themselves in the very textual aspects of those prints, the vernacular prints. Worn out, patined, often dented, marked, bent, and stained, the African-based prints bear the traces of time and their histories like wrinkles on a face, while the new exhibition prints systematically smooth and polish them. As we think about what the ethics of looking and collecting of institutions could look like in the 21st century, it would certainly be, the idea would certainly be to let all these layers and all these traces be seen, no longer eluding, but embracing all the lives of these objects. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. It's amazing how the papers are talking to one another. I remind the audience that they're encouraged to write questions in the Q&A. And now we'll have our third speaker, Giulia Paoletti.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to all the presenters who have preceded and follow me. It's an honor to be among you all today. Linguère Fatou Fall can, in a heartbeat and without hesitation, name her ancestor back 4 generations. Within her social circle, she's known for her interest in Senegal's history, which she regularly discusses on social media. Sharing the same passion, a friend of hers in Italy one day sent her a link from The Guardian online, featuring historical photographs from Senegal. Linguère, he wrote, "You will enjoy these." Little did he know, those photographs portrayed Madame Fall's own grandparents, Mr. Macky Kane and Madame Fatou Choun. Here we see them together in their home as they pose on a white embroidered bed and look straight into the camera. Fatou Choun is sitting upright with the leather camera bag on her lap. Her hair, coiffed in the Nguka style, is tightly wrapped under a silk headscarf with 2 shining silver coins asymmetrically framing her gaze. Behind her, casually reclining, is her husband, Macky Kane, whose left hand tenderly reaches for her arm. Behind them, dozens of small and medium-sized photos are carefully arranged on the walls. Some are visibly in full and are deliberately attached to a woven panel at diagonal angles. Others are framed and suspended across the corner of the room, their orientation doubling that of this very photograph. Along with 15 other photographs, part of the same series, this portrait was first published in 1998 without attribution, and it has remained, to most, nameless until 2019, when Madame Fall celebrated on social media the sitters and authors of the series as her grandparents, Mr. Macky Kane and Madame Fatou Choun. Between 1998 and 2019, these images have circulated widely around the world in exhibition from Bamako to Cape Town, from New York to Madrid. They were featured in academic publications, photo books, and glossy magazines. These shots have entered collections in Europe, the US, and Africa in the form of gelatin negative, vintage prints, and ensuing reproductions. In the ether, they circulate freely and rarefied through the internet and social media. So enticing, this corpus has become one of the continent's most captivating series. The elegance of its sitters, that rare, intimate portrayal of daily life, the mystery that surrounded their author, and of course, those family walls covered in photos have intrigued viewers around the world, promising a new, unseen history of photography. For decades, researchers have tried to identify their author, whom, now we know, had been before our eyes the whole time. The sudden disclosure of the author's name dramatically and abruptly transformed the manner in which we attend to photographic objects. This paper asks, what happens when we have a name? Building on interviews with Maki Khan and Fatou Choun descendants conducted in Dakar in 2021, I pay attention to biographical elements that enrich and redress past interpretation of this corpus and its significance within the larger history of photography. I explore the repercussions of such transformations as these objects' multiple authors, photographers, sitters, printers, and viewers shift from anonymous to named, and the photographs move from being undated to having specific temporality, from carrying enigmatic caption to labels claiming ownership. In pursuing this endeavor, I do not strive to offer a biographical account or a history of the proper name, to use Rosalind Krauss' terms, where the meaning of the tale reduces to just this question of identity. In fact, these now named authors are not exhausted in an act of reference, but rather disclose photography's centrifugal relations. This portrait was first published in Revue Noire 1998 Anthology of African Photography, a watershed and visionary volume that offered one of the earliest and most comprehensive study of the histories of photography in the continent. The series was featured in a chapter penned by French journalist Frédéric Chapuis on the pioneers of Saint Louis, the historical capital of Senegal. The photographs were captioned as authored by an anonymous Saint Louisian photographer and belonging to Adama Silla's collection. Adama Silla is a Senegalese photographer who built over the years a collection comprising negatives and vintage prints such as these. And in the late 1990s, when Western scholars began to learn about the history of photography in Africa, Silla became a key figure, one of the most knowledgeable collectors whom researchers could consult. For instance, I interviewed him at least twice in 2010 and 2013, but many others both preceded and followed me. In those interviews, Silla explained that the author of this photograph was a Saint Louisian amateur who was passionate about photography. According to Silla, the man gave him 2 boxes of photographs and said that he wanted to remain anonymous, as he did not like this sort of visibility. As such, Silla never disclosed the photographer's identity, and the images circulated nameless until 3 years ago, when Madame Fall recognized her grandparents on The Guardian online. By a strange coincidence, on that very day, on November 19, 2019, her grandma, or Mambujigin, would have been 100 years old. Starting that day and every year since, Madame Fall has celebrated her birthday by posting on Facebook the portrait of a woman who she never met. 2 years after this portrait was taken in 1941, with her pregnant belly barely visible, Fatou Choun passed away. The photos that you will see today are all part of the same series and were taken by the same camera between 1941 and 1943, the year Choun passed away. From that day, her husband hardly ever used a camera again. Anonymity describes the state of being nameless, a quality that instantly and irrevocably locks a subjectivity into invisibility. Anonymity has always been central to photography, a medium whose umbilical relation to memory is distinctive. Most photographs, that is, the vast majority of photographs that have ever been and will ever be taken, partake in this paradox. People shot them in order to remember, but they're doomed to be forgotten along with their authors and sitters. The question of anonymity takes on a whole other dimension in the field of African art, where until the late 1990s, there were only a handful of known, that is, named African artists, such as Olowe of Ise and Seydou Keïta. In approaching the conundrum, Susan Vogel argued that in the arts of Africa, authorship dissipates because the author name is often irrelevant to the life of the art object, and thus no special effort is made to preserve it. Many other names may be equally, if not more important to an object life, such as those of viewers, owners, spirits, and dancers. In some cases, authorship is something to be hidden or only disclosed to a select few. Still, Vogel, alongside other scholars, worked relentlessly to recover artists' hands. Invoking a name can be more than an obsolete gesture of connoisseurship. The recovery of an artist's name can be a critical step in practices of decolonization. As Zoe Strother has argued, the transition from the third person plural, they, as in a people, to a third personal singular, that is, a historical author with a proper name, has a transformative effect in making visible, distinct, and finite individuals and histories. Similarly, art historian Olabukola Gbagye has encouraged scholars to recover the personal and professional lives of African photographers. In a field that remains overwhelmingly focused on the colonial function of photography, centering the African experience is critical to redress the apparent absence of local actors. So, what happens when a name is invoked? A wealth of historical details become available. In my interviews with Madame Fall, she recounted the life of her grandparents. Her grandfather, Macky Khan, was born in Mali in 1911, and like his wife, who was born in Ivory Coast, grew up living across West Africa. Yet she insisted they were both the children of Saint Louis, with at least 2 generations before them linked to the island. Macky Khan worked in the French administration and in 1960 alongside Senegal's first prime minister at the Ministry of Finance. Eventually, Khan developed a taste for photography. He ordered his camera like other luxury items directly from France. His granddaughter repeated a number of times that he was not a photographer. That is, unlike professional photographers like Mama Kassé working at the time in the city, Khan took snapshots during his leisure time. An amateur, he walked with his camera in and out of his home throughout the cityscape, experimenting with the camera freely and extemporaneously. An amateur, he would bring his negatives to be developed at a photographic studio where Mama Kassé was working as an apprentice. An amateur, he was not the sole author of these shots. His wife, Fatou Chun, was his co-author and favorite sitter. Often the only person fully figured and in perfect focus, looking with piercing eyes through the camera lens at her husband and the soon-to-be father. In recovering Khan's and Chun's names and lives, my intention is to move beyond Western modernist fixation on the author's singularity or even separateness. In this series, the images do not originate and end with the man who bought the camera. While Macky Khan purchased the camera, the images indicate that he was not the only author. In at least one shot, Khan is in front of the camera. Often the sitters carry the camera bag. Other photographers were responsible for developing the negatives. In fewer words, this series makes visible photography's relational field, in George Becker's terms. The act of recovering these names and their authorship holds the potential to reclaim a history of photography that is not content with the celebration of the single name. In their performance of sociability, these objects point to a less heroic, but possibly more revolutionary exploration of authorship and the photographic medium. Consider this image. This portrait of Fatou Chun has mesmerized because of the elegance of its sitter, but too for those walls covered in photographs. It is not, however, the only one featuring and figuring forth walls covered in photos. In the series, at least a dozen sitters insist on exploring and enacting the same composition, placing themselves and eventually their own likeness within the walls of photographs. These galleries of photos create and disclose an expansive image world. Slightly behind Chun's head, it is possible to make out a portrait of a white woman in a swimsuit posing on a ladder. Other walls include portraits of North African film stars, white couples locked in a close embrace, photo cards with group portraits, postcards of European paintings of a gondola, and even Chun pyramidal portrait from this very series. This detail confirms that these images were shot in order to be displayed and seen in the house. At the same time, the doubling of the object and the images that it figures forth becomes intricately layered. In Western photography, the trope of the image within the image is regularly interpreted as a depiction of photography itself, that is, via doubling, repetition, and splitting, visualizes the nature of photography as a representation of a representation. Yet I argue that in the Saint Louisian series, the family wall is not the photographer's formalist fixation, albeit it does indicate a deliberate intention. Here, the doubling effect of the picture within the picture does not speak to a modernist concern with reflexivity in a vertiginous, narcissistic duplication of the self. Quite the opposite. These walls disclose the centrifugal relational quality of photography, as each image points outward and elsewhere, establishing relations with other subjects, gazes, and image worlds. For decades, scholars have documented but barely studied the existence of a distinctly Saint Louisian practice of curating photographs in one's home. This practice, called hoimet in Wolof, entailed decorating a room before a woman married. Senegalese writer Fatou Niang Siga explains that for 2 weeks, the bride's friends would go from house to house to borrow the most beautiful photographic prints from relatives and friends. The whole wall would be covered in photos and interspersed with objects and souvenirs. This decoration was executed by a specialist, and the final work, that is, the decorated room, was called hoimet. The wedding ceremony was then animated by musicians and griots who celebrated the families of the future married couple. The term hoimet needs some unpacking too. Linguist Mariam C. explained to me that before it was associated with this photographic practice, the term hoimet indicated a quick action that would reveal something with the purpose of enticing the viewer to see more. For instance, a woman would be hoimetting a man while dancing. A woman would hoimet a textile as she plunged it quickly into the dye to intensify its hue. The term hoimet then suggests playfulness, sensuality, but also a distinct tempo, as the action is always quick and intermittent, as a glittering light. Most crucially, it builds the expectation that there can be more to that visual experience, which is always partial and purposefully enticing. In this sense, the woman preparing the photographic room seeks to hoimet their future husband and any viewer entering the visual field. The woman wants to offer a glimpse of who she is and her world. The hoimet calls for the viewer attention while indicating that there may be more to be seen. The Hoymet, as both a cultural practice and as a visual experience, gives a sense of the richness of Senegal conceptual universes, where the optical, affective, and political cannot be disentangled. Let me give you one last example. In this Hoymet, the bride and her friends included the portrait of Fatou Gueye. Fatou Gueye was a famous political figure in Saint Louis who was part of the mobilization for the election of the first Black representative in the French National Assembly, the Senegalese Blaise Diagne, in 1914. Fatou Gueye's portrait was taken by the Frenchman Houstalier in the 1890s. Most likely, Fatou Gueye had commissioned the portrait, which then circulated without her consent as a postcard, where she's listed nameless as a wife of a Wolof trader. Similarly to Fatou Chun's portrait, which has circulated without attribution and consent worldwide, Fatou Gueye's own likeness too was distributed stripped of her name. But her portrait is included here without a caption or a backdrop, but enlarged and framed as part of a Hoymet, where her name and legacy will be recounted. In Campt's series, the Hoymet is not a passive backdrop, but an active locus that anchors and unleashes photography's relations. As we watch it unfold, we witness the citational power of photography and the depths that each photograph can unravel. Each wall and each photo disclose rather than encode. They activate connection rather than fix indexes. Like Derrida once wrote, each photograph whispers a proper name, but it also becomes the appellation of all the others, without compromising in the least its absolute independence. Each of them is what it is, no doubt, all on its own, but each one calls at once some the other and all the others. And the act of naming is essential for activating them. When named, their histories may enact a process of decolonization. Madame Fall, like other Saint Louisian women who came before her, such as Fatou Gueye, is rewriting the history of Senegal. As she named her grandparents, she decided to engage with the other authors, including Silla and Revenoir, to this day, without legal action, to reclaim this visual patrimony and a history of photography. In one last photograph, unlike the others, Fatou Chun finally holds in her arms her first daughter, Nafi Khan, who is only a few weeks old. It is the first time that we catch a glimpse of her smile as she holds up her firstborn. It is the only image in the series of Fatou Chun with her daughter, who has since continues to look at them, remembering and recounting to her own daughter who her grandmother was. Thank you.